Hi, this is Ellen Silva. Today I'd like to show you a technique for grafting a tube of stranded knitting together end to end and in pattern and absolutely seamlessly. I started developing this technique after Sarah Bauer of the Yarns at Yinhu podcast contacted me asking for ideas on how to finish off a cowl that she was currently designing. She wanted something that would be seamless and let her pattern meet end to end, so you could go in a continuous circle around the neck in a tube of knitting that had patterning on the front and the back of it. Well, I searched the internet first thing, of course, and I just didn't find much that fit the bill. I could find things that grafted fair isle together that had been knitted flat. I could find things that grafted fair isle together using one single color for the grafting row, but I didn't find anything that checked all the boxes. Grafting a tube, end to end, stranded knitting pattern, and absolutely seamlessly. And I'm happy to say that the technique that I have developed, and I'm not claiming I'm the first person to develop this, but maybe mine will be the one you can find on the internet when you search. I'm happy to say that it does actually check all those boxes. You go around this tube of knitting and you will not find a seam. Not on the outside, not on the inside. You can't feel a seam. It's all one piece of fabric, one layer of fabric in the tube, and you just can't figure out where this cowl started or ended. It's a continual flow of this delightful design that Sarah has come up with. Let's get started and I'll show you how it's done. So what we're going to do is use waste yarn to create something like a grafting template for us to follow as we graft our stranded knitting tube together. We will use that waste yarn to not only stabilize our stitches, which will let them lie flat so that we can actually see what stitches in what color we are matching to each other, but we'll also actually follow the path of that waste yarn for the tops and the bottoms of the stitches just to reassure us that we're grafting properly. This is a technique that Lucy Neatby developed for finishing off sock toes quite some time ago. And she probably wasn't the first either, but she popularized the technique quite nicely. And it was the first thing I thought of when I knew I needed to do some tricky grafting. We're going to make those chimneys in a way that they're easy to remove, because once we graft this tube together, we can't easily access the waste yarn to cut it out or anything like that. We're going to have it so that we can simply pull one end and pull it right out of the middle of that tube. So that is what we're going to do, and I'll show you what we need to do it. You're going to need two very blunt tapestry needles. We want them blunt so we won't be splitting the yarn when we are doing our grafting. That's very important. If you split the yarn, if you catch it with a needle, the waste yarn is not going to pull out easily. The other thing we're going to do to ensure that we can pull out our waste yarn easily is we're going to use a very smooth waste yarn, and one that is not highly splittable. This is a pretty solid yarn. It doesn't come apart into many plies, and it's a synthetic material that is very slick. In fact, it's one of those yarns that you really kind of need to have in a yarn bowl when you work with it, because it's so slippery it wants to fall right out of the ball. These are my working yarns, not necessarily colors I would choose for this cowl, but they're very high contrast, so you'll see what I'm doing. And then, of course, knitting needles and the crochet hook is what I'm going to use to create my provisional cast on. This isn't intended to be a demonstration of provisional cast-ons, but I'll show you quickly how I work the provisional cast-on that I like for this technique. It's a crocheted cast-on. I start with a slip knot on my crochet hook. The yarn is behind my needle, and I reach over the needle with the hook and pull a loop of yarn through that slip knot. I now put the yarn back behind the needle and do the same exact thing over and over. Each time I do that, I get a stitch on the needle. So I have 3 stitches, and I'll just continue casting on until I get to the number desired. That number should be the number that you need for your cowl, and you'll determine how wide you want the cowl to be, or if you're knitting some other tube of knitting, you'll know how many stitches you want that tube to be. But you want to cast on, 2 or 3 extra stitches. I'll explain, sorry about that bump. I'll explain why we cast on those extra stitches a bit later. I am making just a swatch here, not a full-size cowl. I just want to be able to show you the techniques that are involved. So I am only going to cast on for a 24 stitch tube, which means I'd like to cast on, 26, 27 stitches. So I just want a few extras. Okay, I've cast on 27 stitches. I want to do a 24 stitch swatch tube. And then to end off, I'm just going to do a couple extra chains. Come on, little yarn, get through there. 1, 2, I'm going to do 3 chains, and I'm going to pull that last one really tight. And then I'm just going to snip that yarn and leave it hanging free. This will make it super easy for me to release that provisional cast on when I'm ready. Now, I have a cast on piece of yarn on my needle. Now I pick up a fresh end, if I can find the end here, of my waste yarn. Remember, super slippery, nice solid waste yarn that doesn't split easily. That is the secret sauce in this technique, I think. And I've got my end. I am going to leave a nice long dangly bit here, but I'm not going to tie my yarn on. I'm just going to start knitting, and I'm going to knit all the way across all the stitches that I just cast on. Okay, coming up to the end here. I've knit my way all the way across that provisional cast on. Got 1 row, and now I'm going to turn around and I'm going to purl back. Okay, we're back at the start, and I've turned the work one more time, and I'm going to knit across. This time, as I knit across, I'm going to divide my stitches up across some double pointed needles so that I can start to knit in the round. So I'll put about 8 or 9 stitches on a needle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's make it 9. I think I have 27 stitches. That'll divide nicely into 3. And I've reached the end. I've got my needles arranged, ready to start knitting in the round. And I'm going to do just that. That first connecting stitch is always a little fun. Don't do anything fancy here to join in the round. Just continue knitting on to the next stitch. Again, we are trying to make this as easy to pull out at the end as possible. And at this point, I'm just going to keep knitting in the round for maybe 4, 5, 6 more rounds, and I'll come back to you when I get that done. All right, so what we have here is a little tube of knitting. It has a provisional cast on at this end, running along the cast on, and then live stitches at the other end. Well, this is actually going to be the end of our tube, so we're going to bind off now. We want to be able to tear this out, as I've mentioned before, so bind off loosely. Just use a standard bind off, knit 2, lift the prior stitch over the second stitch, keep it loose, and continue on. Just loosely bind off all the way around that tube. All right. I have bound off my tube all the way around. I'm left with 1 stitch on my needle. I'm going to open up that loop a little bit, still attached to the ball of yarn. Drop those needles, and I'm going to pick up my crochet hook again, put that loop onto it, and work several chain stitches. This time I might work a few more because this is going to be around a while I work my cowl. Who knows how long it's going to take me to finish a nice full-size cowl. So I'm going to put 5, 6, 7, even 8 chain stitches here so that this won't unravel while I'm working the cowl. Once again, I'm not going to end it off, but I am going to pull that last chain quite tight so it doesn't easily unpull. I'll leave a pretty good loop and just cut off the yarn and leave it just like that. Do not tie that off. We're going to need to be able to pull this loop later and unravel the whole thing. Now we're going to address starting our actual knitting. And to do that, we're going to come back to that provisional cast on side. Here we've left just the tightened loop end to that provisional cast off, and we're going to start releasing that cast off so that we can put live stitches onto a knitting needle. We're going to try to do one at a time. Lost my end. Here we go. All the purple yarn, it's easy to get confused. So I have pulled out my 1 crochet cast on and freed up 1 stitch. I'm going to get it onto that needle. Now that we have it over here, it'll go a little easier. So each crochet stitch that I pull out frees up 1. I'm just slipping them onto the needle as I go. Up to 6. I'm going to work my way around to the 24 that I need, and then we'll talk some more. All right, I've worked my way all the way around the provisional cast on, putting 8 stitches on each of 3 double points so I can continue knitting the actual cowl, or in my case swatch, in the round. And if you'll notice, I still have a couple of stitches left after adding those live stitches. You recall I cast on 3 extra stitches, I believe, so I have a couple extra left. The reason I cast on those extra stitches was so that I wouldn't have the problem that you have with provisional casts on, that going in one direction, say you cast on 8 stitches, on the other side, when you pick up live stitches to go the other direction, you'd only have 7 full stitches and a half stitch on each end. By casting on the extras, I get to pick up entire live stitches, not worry about those half stitches, and I can just pull out the rest of that cast on and not even worry about this loose stitch here. It may run as I work my work, but a drop stitch isn't going to matter in this waste yarn tube. All right, let's start knitting. I'm going to, again, just hold those extra stitches, the ones that I didn't pick up because I already had enough on my needles. I'm just going to hold them down here out of the way. I'm going to pick up my working yarn here, and I'm not going to fasten this end in. I'm just going to let it hang down behind. And I'm going to start knitting in pattern as shown on the chart. The first 2 stitches are in the darker color, and then I'll get to start in with my lighter color. Again, I'm just going to let that end hang down, and I'm going to start knitting with the lighter color and get the first 2 stitches. As you get started with a loose end, it's always a little awkward, but we'll get past those, and a round or 2 in, you won't even notice anymore that you started with a loose end. We'll also tidy those up at the end of the cowl. So we're just going to work our way following the chart. And I believe the pattern for Sarah's cowl has you start on round 4. The reason for that is because round 4 is the third of 3 identical color rounds. We're starting on the third one. You're going to end up ending on the first one, and the second one will be your grafting round. Great thing about that is you'll be able to follow the color pattern for both the bottom and the top of the stitch, just matching the round above and below. Works out really great. So here we're coming up. I'm getting all my way around. Your cowl, of course, will be, more multiples around than just one, but I wanted to make this swatch doable in a time frame where I could share the technique with you when the pattern released. So here I come up to the end of the first repeat, and in my swatch the only repeat. Here are those loose ends for the first needle. I'm just going to ignore that, and I'm going to go on to the next round, which in the pattern would be round 5. It starts out in a similar color pattern to round 4. Okay, let me readjust this yarn here. It's a little bit awkward on my fingers. There we go. And I'll just continue in pattern as per round 5. I'm thinking you don't need to watch me knit this entire swatch, so I'll come back when I have this to a stage where we can show you another technique. All right, so I have knit a bit of swatch. This is where we started. The live stitches were picked up here. I knit this way to create the waste yarn tube, bound off loosely. I have this end that will pull out easily when the time comes. Started knitting the pattern, leaving the live ends completely live, not fastened in any way, and just knit around to create a little swatch cowl. At this point, I decided to save time and just knit in stripes and then plain because I had a little more white yarn than blue, but then I went back to the pattern so that you'll be able to see how we can graft together in pattern very nicely. At the end of round 2, I have ended my pattern, and what I did was I cut 4 lengths, or 4 circumferences length of my ends. I probably could get away with 3, but I never like to play that much yarn chicken, especially in a graft. I don't want to have to start new yarn, so I gave it that little extra bit. But you could probably get away with 3.5 circumferences and just be fine. At this point, what I'm going to do is take those live ends and I'm bringing them to the front of the knitting, right in front of the next stitch. And that's just going to set me up for when it's time to start the grafting. That's where I'm going to want my yarns to be to begin with. At this point, I need to knit some more waste yarn. And just as I did before, I'm using smooth, slippery waste yarn, something that will pull out easily, and I'm going to start knitting just like I did with my working yarns without anchoring that tail. I'm just leaving a tail hanging down, and I'm making sure that I'm not knitting it into the pattern at all. As I get on a little ways, what I'll probably do is tuck that yarn down inside the tube just to keep it completely out of the way. And from here, I'm just going to keep knitting and knit a little bit of a tube and waste yarn, and then I'll be back. Okay, so here we go. As I mentioned before, I had brought my working yarns to the front after my last stitch, and then simply started knitting a tube of waste yarn in the round. I bound it off quite loosely, and when I got to the very end, I did not fasten that end in any way. I simply did a little bit of a chain and pulled the last chain tight and then clipped off the end. That will hold it just fine until we get the grafting done. At this point, what you might want to do with your cowl is give it a little bit of light blocking. I'm going to steam this before we set up to graft. It'll just help the stitches lie a little bit flatter, especially here between the waste yarn and the working yarn, and that'll help me see where my needle needs to go when I'm grafting. You can also, with your larger cowl, it'll be simpler. You can turn to the inside if you want, and if you'll be doing color changes perhaps, and you'll have loose yarns from those color changes. You can either knot those off or weave them in a little bit in the back, whatever you see fit for handling those loose ends. Do not weave in either the end live ends or those two live ends from the very beginning of the cowl. We're going to deal with those in the grafting process, so just leave those be for now. But if you have anything going on in the middle of your cowl, feel free to take care of those ends. I'm going to go do that steaming, and I'm going to set up for the grafting, and then I'll be back. All right, welcome back. I have done a little steam blocking, and you can see how even just the tiniest bit of blocking really improves the appearance of the knitting. If you're not in the blocking camp, I encourage you to give it a try and see how much better your knitting looks. What I have done here after I blocked was I took the waste yarn tubes and tucked them inside the cowl swatch. What I want ideally is just the slightest little edge of waste yarn remaining. And the reason I want that is because I'm going to be following the track of that waste yarn. You can see, for instance, here it comes down into this stitch, goes under these two legs, and comes up in this stitch. And when I am grafting, I'm just going to be following the path of the waste yarn. This would be half of a stitch, and then on the other end I'd be following the waste yarn to finish the top of the stitch. And I'll show you how that's done. I have here just a piece of foam covered with fabric, just to help visibility. You don't need this, but I find it can be useful. I use T-pins just to hold things in place a little bit, and it just, especially while I'm taping this video for you, it helps me not need 3 or 4 hands. I have threaded both ends of the live yarn onto each onto its own very blunt tapestry needle. It's important that the needle be very blunt so that you don't split threads, and especially so that you don't accidentally pick up a few of the strands from the waste yarn, which would get in the way of unraveling. I'm going to set my project up on my grafting surface with the end I just finished knitting towards the bottom and the end that I started at the top. So knitting flowed in this direction. But I'm going to fold up the bottom and fold down the top, and so that means I'm now looking at a surface where the knitting is going in this direction from bottom to top. Here's where I'm going to use those T-pins just to discreetly hold things in place so that I'm not going to have to be wrestling with it all the time. And we'll get started grafting. I have set this up on my board so that the surface that ends up on top is the surface where I can see the very last stitch that I knit, this white one right here. And I can also see the very first stitch I knit in the pattern, this blue one here. Find that first stitch, and it's useful before you get started to tidy those first few stitches up a little bit. Sometimes I need to tug down a little bit just so I can really see a complete stitch in each of those first 2 stitches. But first, let's get our yarns set in place. And in order to prevent yarns coming across the surface when in reality we'd like them to be behind the fabric, to prevent yarns getting twisted and things, what I always do is I just lay the unused yarn in the crack between the 2 ends. I'm now working completely on top of that, so when I come down here to take a stitch, I'll be coming down on top. When I come up here from the bottom, I'll be going over that, and that will keep the yarn properly in the back. And with that, I think we can start grafting. All right, as I mentioned before, this is our last stitch, and the next color to be worked is going to be a blue stitch if you look at the chart. And so I lay the yarn that was used to make that last white stitch down between. With the blue yarn tip, I know the next stitch is going to come up out of this blue stitch. See the waste yarn coming up out of it? That's exactly what I want to do. On the first stitch, I just catch one leg. And I'll pull it all the way through. Now let's come up here to the top, and here's my row of blue stitches that I need to be grafting into. In this case, I can see the waste yarn comes behind this leg, and it doesn't come out of that stitch, it goes on behind the second leg. So I can catch both of those legs at once, pull the yarn through, and I can tug it up a little bit. You don't have to quite yet, you can do that adjustment a bit later. And I'm ready to come back down, and I'm following the waste yarn down into the stitch, and on this one the waste yarn continues on to the second leg. It's also a blue stitch, so I can continue to that second stitch and start the second one. Then I come up to the top, I follow my waste yarn behind one leg, behind two legs to form the top of the stitch, and now I'm ready to come down to the bottom stitch. Here the waste yarn continues to the next stitch, but the color doesn't. I need to switch to a white yarn to come up and out. So what I'll do is come up between the two stitches, pull it through, and now it's the blue yarn's turn to lay down in the gap between the two pieces. I pull the white yarn up, and it's going to complete the path of the waste yarn coming up through the first white stitch in this round. After working that, just as before, we'll come up to the top, and the waste yarn, I hope you can see that there, is traveling in behind that white stitch. I can get both legs because I'm still on the same stitch. I'm completing the top of the white stitch, and I can do both legs at once. And then coming down to the bottom where I go into the stitch that I came out of. Just as before, the next stitch is also white, so in one fell swoop I can move right over to that next stitch, come up through it, pull my yarn on through, let's go up to the top, catch those two legs, and you should start to see the rhythm. We're just forming a row of stitches that match round 3, which is so convenient that it matches round 2 and round 4. We don't even have to think about the color scheme. And I came out here between the two stitches because the next stitch is blue. If I came up here through that blue stitch, it would make the next stitch white, and we know that that's wrong. It's supposed to be blue here, so the white stitches the white yarn's turn is over, and it goes back into the gap. Now as I work, especially now that I've gotten a few stitches in, I do kind of like to go back and neaten things up a little bit. I try to get it pretty close to gauge as I'm working. You could work it loose the whole way through, but then you're going to have to backtrack and work lots of yarn all the way around. It's possible. Some people might prefer it, but I prefer to get my gauge fairly good, fairly well matching right from the get-go. And I do that just with the tip of the needle. I just give a little tug, get them through to where I want them to be. And then I can pick up again with the next color. And what's the next color going to be here? Well, I can see it's going to be blue, and I need to start that stitch, come up, I have to go down between the two stitches to get to it, and then I can come to get back to where that waste yarn was, and then I can come up through that stitch. And then, as before, back to the top stitch. And sometimes you have to work a little bit to pull that stitch down and make it pretty. And you always want to be sure that you're not, jabbing like through the waste yarn. That's why that blunt tip is so important. I'm not jabbing through other yarns. I'm going in between the threads and behind the legs and finishing off the top of that stitch. Looks here like I'm leaving this white yarn showing, but really a little tug of it, and it's going to go down behind the stitching. Work the bottom of that stitch, start the bottom of the next stitch, go back up to the top, and so on and so forth. Now, if you did, by some accident, say, leave that yarn out on top as you're working, make sure I'm just getting that stitch. There we go. Oh, this one right here. What that means is when you go to work the next stitch, you'll have yarn traveling over the surface of your work, and that is not what you want. Super simple to fix that. Just unthread your needle, back that yarn out. I'll rethread the needle, and we'll go in through the hole where it was left, come back out under everything, and now I'm up. See, I did what I told you not to do. Don't catch any threads of that waste yarn. Fixing that all up, and now I can come back and follow the trail of the waste yarn again into that next stitch. Here it looks like I'm getting pretty close to the edge. I'll need to readjust my piece, kind of turn it around a little bit, rotate it so that I can get to the next portion of it and continue grafting. And that's what I'm going to do, and I'll come back to you when I make my way pretty well on around to the end of the piece. All right, I'm coming towards the closure of my piece. I thought maybe we could just graft along together for a couple more stitches, and then I'll show you. I'm trying to make sure here that this stitch hasn't pulled too tightly and I don't end up trapping waste yarn. Anyway, after we get to a couple more stitches in here, I'm going to show you how we remove that waste yarn and finish up the grafting. Going back and forth between colors. That was my second white stitch, so now it's time for a blue stitch. Come up through the blue. Form the top of the stitch. Come back through the blue and catch the leg of the next blue stitch. Catch the two legs for the next stitch above. And, you know, take your time, make sure you get the needle where you want it. Time to switch over to white, so I catch just one leg coming back. And I am going to adjust tension a bit on these last few stitches before I go any further. Trying to match the stitch size on the stitches surrounding them without pulling a tight strand in the fabric of the cowl. So just do it gently, take your time, be patient with yourself and your project, and it'll work out great. So we can see now I've got just this little, almost like a little buttonhole looking end. This is the point at which I think I want to start sorting out this waste yarn. And I'm going to pull my waste yarn tubes towards me through the hole so that I can find their ends. Here's the end of the bind off for the bottom waste yarn tube. And let's see if we can't find it for the top one as well. It's got to be here somewhere. Oh, there it is, right there. At this point, I like to go ahead and start doing some of the unraveling. And you noticed I just was able to pull that thread, and I'm able to unravel, get a lot of the waste yarn out of the way for as I finish. I'm going to set that end off this way. And I'm also, by doing this, I'm checking that there weren't any issues, that I didn't accidentally catch the waste yarn further back. This is about as far as I'm going to go, though. I want some waste yarn still holding these stitches in place, so I think I'll just leave that one there. Let's check that this one wants to unravel as well. Yep, that's going very nicely so far. And I think that's enough on that one too. I'll leave that one be as well. And let's finish up a little bit more of the oh, the other thing I want to do right now is find the live ends. Here are a couple. Those are the ends from the start of the cowl. I'm going to pull those out and have them here. And then, of course, these two are my other live ends. Don't have to do much hunting for them. But I will remember to lay the yarn I'm not working back between the two pieces, and then I can continue on with my grafting. Bring this baby home. Working above that waste yarn, not catching it. You can pull the waste yarn out a little bit if it helps you see where the stitches are. That's something I do, especially when a stitch has gotten tightened up in the course of my light blocking or something like that. Switch to blue on the next one, so I go only under one leg. Oh, and I want to lay this back down in the gap. Pick up the blue. Those of you who are watching super closely will notice that I'm always picking up the blue from below the white, and I'm picking up the white from above the blue. What this does is, if we were able to turn this piece inside out, we'd see that the white strands travel along the back side of the fabric above the blue strands. And that, in turn, means that the blue strands will be slightly dominant in the color. So if you're familiar with color dominance and we're wondering how to maintain that, and see here I'm picking up the white from above the blue, that is what is going to maintain that color dominance. We are really getting close to the end here now. Just a few stitches left. This white one, come up and find its next stitch. Oh, don't want to split that next stitch. Come just under the two legs. Come back down. And I'm leaving, notice that I'm leaving these stitches quite large. That'll give me a little bit of space here at the very end to do some manipulation. And then I can tighten up the gauge at the very, very end. And the last one, I think, yep, that is it. You can see these blues are grafted together and then these whites. And now at this point, what I want to do is cross your fingers, hope that I can continue pulling out the waste yarn until it is completely unraveled from the piece. That one came pretty well. There's a little bit left in there. We'll take this one out, see if that doesn't help matters. Oh, seems that I have a couple little sticky spots here. Sometimes that'll happen. Sometimes just a brisk tug is all you need. The fibers of your wool yarn may have caught that waste yarn. And I also see that I just twisted up my ends a little bit at the end, so I can pull that out. Haha, one waste yarn gone. Let's see if that helps me with the untangling of this one. And the other one's gone, just like that. Both completely unraveled. I'm now in a good position to adjust the gauge on those remaining stitches. You probably won't get them perfect, the exact same size as the rest of your work, but if you get them close, nobody will ever notice. So those are my white stitches are done. I'm pretty happy with the white stitch over there. I'm just going to lay those two white ends off to the side. And now let me go back and check those blue stitches. I think this could be tightened up just a tad. And the blue stitches are done. Awesome. What do we do next? Well, I don't like working with ends that are quite that long. I'm just going to clip off the end with the needle on it. And this is my favorite part. I get to just knot these together. Give it a good tug, not the blue ones. And it's as simple as threading those yarns onto a tapestry needle. Go right back in through the same hole and then come out anywhere you want, but a distance away from the hole. Hide that little knot down there. Do the same with the white. Remember, go exactly through the hole those yarns came up out of. Go a little distance away. Clearly I split a yarn there, but it won't matter because what I'm going to do next is I'm going to pull it out. Clip it off close to the surface, and then the ends will pop right inside. We'll do the same thing on that blue. Pull it out a little bit, close to the surface, and just like that, we have a grafted piece. Very, very difficult to see the beginning or the end. You can probably see this tiny bit of pucker right here. That will even out again as you block it. And I can see that I think with a larger cowl, you will have even less distortion of the fabric as you go. And so there you have it, your seamless grafting of the Christmas in July cowl.